Thank you, Heather. Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Bryn Mawr Film Institute Film Studies Online discussion of Poor Things. My name is Andrew Douglas. I'm Deputy Director at BMFI, and I'm very happy to be joined by our Director of Programs and Education, Jacob Mazer. Jacob, how are you this evening?
I'm well, thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to talking about this film with you and the rest of our attendees.
Yes, I really can't wait to hear what our attendees have to say. That should be supremely interesting. Hopefully, they got some sort of preparation by watching your very informative introduction to the film. And those of you who didn't, that'll remain up on our website, so you'll have a chance to watch it, uh, you know, down the line if you haven't. We're very happy that you're here, and we want to hear from you, but in an orderly fashion, so everyone can be part of the discussion if they wish to be. So please keep your audio on mute unless you're asking a question. You will, if you can't mute right now, you will be able to mute. And please make sure after you ask your question, you mute again. The way you'll know that it's your turn to ask your question or make your comment is I will call on you. And the way I'll know to call on you is I will look for the little raise hand symbol, which you can see illustrated at the bottom of this slide. Please raise that hand to let us know you'd like to participate in the discussion. And of course, there's a chat function within Zoom, and you're welcome to share information that way. Introduce yourself if you're new to our discussions, and just in general, talk about something else if you don't like what we're talking about. Also share links if someone, mentions an article they read or something like that, you can put those there too. Well, with that, I think we are ready to start once we see some hands up. Let's see. I'm not seeing any hands yet. That can only mean that some of our regulars aren't on board yet. That must be what it is, right? Oh, there we go.
No,
I see one.
I'm a new person who never attended one of your discussions before. I'm very much looking forward to it. I don't have any questions right off the bat, but I hope you'll have some things to kind of prompt us into the discussion.
We will. Thanks, Carolyn. I do see a hand from Dina. Dina, do you have a question or comment?
I don't, not yet.
Oh, okay. I see some other hands. I hope people aren't just raising their hands to say hi. Melissa, do you have a question or comment?
No, we're just saying hi.
Hi.
I thought you said you wanted hands up. I don't know. We were just making
No,
we were
only
here.
if you. That's okay. Only if you have a question or comment. Steve, you must have a question or comment.
I do. Am I unmuted? Okay, great.
Go
So,
ahead.
can you hear me?
Yep, please go ahead.
I wonder if Jacob's introduction would have been any different if he would have seen the film versus not have seen the film, because I was amazed. First of all, she won two global awards last night, Golden Globe Awards last night for her performance, which is well deserved from what I could tell. But I am fascinated by the fact an individual who has that much credibility, who has done so many marvelous things, would take the risk of doing a movie like that. And I wonder if there's any background on that, which I could not find, as to why she took that on, although she thought it was a fascinating role. But to put herself out there, it's something that no featured movie star has done ever that I'm aware of. And I was wondering what your thoughts were and what Jacob's thoughts were.
Jacob, you want to start off? You're muted, Jacob.
Thanks, Andrew. First of all, Steve, great to see you. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for being here. You asked, first of all, whether I would have approached the introduction in a different way had I seen the movie first. Maybe, but I think, for those who haven't seen it in a while, or who didn't watch it, I mean, the things that I touched on in the introduction were mainly what I consider to be the principal sort of lens that Lanthimos brings to all of his subjects, which is to sort of look at the customs and social codes and structures and patterns of behavior and the way we do things through some sort of dramatic situation that puts it askew, that sort of gives us the perspective of somebody who is seeing things in a different way. And maybe that's because of, the way that they have something about that character, as we see in this film, or, in a sort of dramatic setup, or with a science fiction conceit, as we see in films like The Lobster. And he makes us look at familiar things in an unfamiliar way, and that causes us, I think, sometimes to reflect on, why we do what we do, and why the world is the way it is. So, I mean, I think that's a pertinent theme in this film. Certainly, we can talk about it more as we go. I also touched on the Frankenstein parallel, and I do hope that's something that we can get into in this film too. Now, with regards to Emma Stone's participation in the film, I can fill some of that in, but Andrew, I want to leave some space for you too. Do you have did you want to say that, or shall I?
You can start, and if you don't say anything that I have an idea on, I'll share it.
Sure thing. Well, so Emma Stone and Yorgos Lanthimos had an established working relationship going into this film. Emma Stone had previously been in his film The Favorite, which I think is from 2017. And this is, in fact, one of several projects that they have worked on together. In addition to The Favorite, they made a short film right before this one. And actually, they have another film that they've completely shot and is in post-production right now, called Kind of Kindness, or something like that. So it is an established working relationship. As for Emma Stone, I mean, her career has been very interesting. She started out, if I recall, in like teen comedy films. And she's successful very early. And I think it's a credit to her that, having established herself, and I'm sure, made enough money to be in a secure position, to take on really challenging and daring roles and things that, you wouldn't expect from somebody who began in the lane that she began in.
No, it's quite a jump from Spider-Man.
Yeah.
I think that the biggest reason is the working relationship that Jacob alluded to. A lot of what actors are or aren't willing to do has to do with how their comfort level with the filmmakers, either the director or other filmmakers involved, or multiple folks on the production. I think you did see acclaimed, credible, successful leading actresses take on roles like this in the 70s. In the 70s were a very different time, obviously, but I think it's not entirely unheard of in the history of Hollywood. But in general, you're right. So-called A-list actors don't typically reveal themselves, take roles with so much sexuality and nudity in them. But I think she must have not only wanted to work with Lanthimos and trusted his vision, but probably also something in the story or its theme struck a chord with her.
And the fact that it was acknowledged by the Golden Globes last night in a very positive way, without any nuances or innuendos, was really fascinating to watch. I thought that was pretty impressive. They appreciated the role she took rather than many years ago how it might have been viewed. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much, guys.
Thank you. Mary Ann, you have a question or comment?
Yes, thank you. So my comment is about the content and context. So the content of Bella's behavior, if it was put in the context of today, it would not be as stunning, and that's one of the things that I was really struck with is to keep in mind that that behavior was happening in the context of the Victorian era. And her sexual exploration aside, even just how she dressed and how she moved was shocking for that time period. So I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts about that.
Jacob, you want to start?
Sure thing. Great to see you, Marianne, by the way. I'm glad to see you in here. Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought up the subject of the Victorian context. I mean, this is a sort of steampunk science fiction fantastical version of the Victorian era, but that is kind of where we're situated. And this, of course, is a time that is famous for having sort of rigorous strictures and social codes, particularly about sex, but also about, other kinds of conduct, and particularly about the way that women are supposed to behave and present themselves. I think it is not an accident that the character, the mother character, whose body Bella has, although she has the brain of the child, is named Victoria. So there's a sense where, we're sort of leaving Victoria behind and moving into, something else. But I mean, I think this is one of the ways that, this is a very Lanthimos-esque narrative. He puts this character who has not been socialized into the society, who hasn't been raised, or, hasn't internalized its sense about strictures, about propriety, about shame, about what and what shouldn't be private, and what should or shouldn't be public, or how you behave. In short, it takes a character and drops her in this adult world, and especially in this adult world with all these rules about how you're supposed to behave. Somehow somebody manages to enter an interface with the adult world without all the socialization that people have, that people normally have to bring them there. And that sets up this very interesting dynamic, where she interfaces with things sort of with this kind of naivete and this sort of ignorance that I think sometimes exposes things, or at least, causes us to look at certain dynamics in society and in behavior in curious ways. What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, I frankly, I mean, it makes sense to set it in another period because that's, I mean, for the reasons you said. I don't know if you had to go back to the Victorian era, but I think that there are reasons it's set there, whether it's the sort of, for all the reasons that the Frankenstein story comes about in generally that time, for the focus in that era on technology and advancement and pushing the scientific envelope, so to speak. I think that's there. And because it's known to be so socially restrictive, I frankly was surprised that she wasn't greeted, treated, reacted to even more with even more shock than her character was. I can think of reasons why that wouldn't have been the case, not the least of which is it would really sort of be a drag on the momentum of the story, so to speak, if every time she encountered someone, they had to be sort of, they had to fall on their fainting couch or whatever. But I actually had an issue with all the sexuality. I understand the point of it. I understand why it's important for the theme and important for that character, but I thought it was excessive, and I found it, I don't know what the word is, maybe dispiriting, that the film seemed to put so much of her personal expression and self-exploration and sort of freeing of herself in terms of sexuality, and not in other ways. I know it was represented in other ways. I know she read books and she went places and she talked to people and things like that. But I felt like there was such a focus on her sexuality, and I found that in some ways reductive. I know that that's in many ways, particularly at that time, a very prominent issue. But I thought it was reductive. So and frankly, I think being set in that era, there could have been far less of it, and it would have made sort of basically the same point. So that's what I think about that.
Can I say a couple things in response to that, Andrew?
Sure.
I hope that others will chime in too. I see some hands going up, and I'm interested to hear what you guys thought about this. But I had a couple thoughts about the role of sexuality in the film. I mean, so one thing is I think in some ways the sort of sexuality of the character is a sort of general signifier for a kind of life of experience and gusto. And in some ways, I think this is signified a little bit in the sort of last passage where she goes back, with Christopher Abbott's character, the horrible general who, schemes to basically castrate her, and that it seems like a sort of stand-in also for the kind of the end of her life of seeking and her life of experience. The other thing I want to say, or the other 2 points I want to make is, I think this is a journey from innocence to experience, and we sort of track her through this rapid development, these sort of rapid stages of human development. And, in that sense, I think it's interesting to note that in the sort of very first steps out into the world or into the adult world, the things that preoccupy her are basically the base sort of human instincts, carnal and Epicurean. She wants to eat, she wants to listen to music, and she wants to, screw around. But that's not, I think, where she ends the film. And I think that's something that we shouldn't keep in mind. She meets an older person who has the character Martha, who has, we see sort of shifted focus away from sort of, bodily sensuality into a kind of life of the mind. And, she ends the film not quite there, but certainly not as focused on, on the sexual matters as she is at the beginning.
Yeah, but it's the very end of the film, and I feel like there's so much time spent in France with her working as a prostitute, and I didn't, I thought that point was very much belabored, but it's one person's perspective. Let's hear from some other folks. Deirdre, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I thought this was a really interesting film, and it's one of my favorites by this director. I thought he really kind of cut loose in this film, which kind of took off the restraints that he has in some of his other ones, like The Lobster and Killing of the Sacred Deer. I thought, as an actress, to go back to Steve's comment, I thought this would be a fantastic role for an actress to be to follow the arc from being a baby to being a feminist, and sort of everything in between. And I thought it was a really raw and gutsy performance. I was very happy to see her get a Golden Globe. I thought, yes, there was a lot of sexuality, explicit, but to me, I thought it was pretty damn hilarious, actually. And I think part of it is her arc from childhood, from babyhood to feminist. She had to break through the strictures, the guardrails that have been put on women, which is their sexuality has been denigrated. And so I think the fact that she had to go through some of those pretty gritty experiences, she really came out stronger. They were grotesque, but I think that led to her success as a feminist. And I feel like going from a child to the sensibility of an older woman is something that women do. I mean, as we get older, we become less sexual and more interested in a life of the mind. And I thought that was a really interesting end to the film.
Okay. Thank you, Deirdre. Jacob, do you have any thoughts on what she said?
No, I mean, I appreciate that perspective. One of the things that I really struck me about Emma Stone's performance, which you touched on too, was just the physicality of it. one of the things that I think is remarkable, when a performer can do it, is to sort of change, I don't know, to give a character like their own sort of, unique physical existence. Not everybody can do it, and she really not only defines kind of she doesn't just create one physical language for this character. There's this whole sort of procession of movements throughout it. I am glad too to hear your perspective on kind of her journey through the film, with respect both to her sexuality and to her, broader arc as a person. That's a thread I hope that we can, continue to pursue as we go through this conversation.
Yeah, I think it's a tremendous performance as well. I just think we also have to remember to give the director some credit for that.
Sure. Sure.
Who at least gave her some guidance or some parameters or something. But yes, she does an unbelievable job with something that must have been quite seemed like quite a challenge when first confronted with it.
And it is
Ken, I'm sorry, Jacob.
And it is funny too.
Yeah, oh, it is. Ken, you have a question or comment?
Hi, yes. Emma Stone absolutely stole the show, but that takes nothing away from the three men that supported her. And I'd love to hear an analysis as to where they fit as we look at them as Victorians. But I do want to make a comment about Willem Dafoe was the kindest and nicest Dr. Frankenstein that we've seen, with such a layered backstory. I think this was such an interesting reworking of the tropes of Frankenstein. And I would love to hear you break down each of the three men, the one played by Mark Ruffalo, Rami, and Willem Dafoe, and how you see it differ from the classic characters that were in those roles in the horror classics.
Oh, how interesting.
Jacob, go ahead.
Sure, I'll speak to that first. It's funny that you categorize them that way, because I was thinking about the men in this story and kind of a sort of maybe on different tracks. I kind of approached this film as a Bildungsroman, the sort of journey of a character from innocence to experience. And as I was watching the film, I was trying to keep track of all these sort of different mentor figures, that she has over the course of the film, some of whom stay with her, some of whom, lose their relevance. So, in that respect, I think, I thought about Godwin, or God, played by Willem Dafoe, as the first mentor. And then, and he's a sort of paternal instructor, but also, the paternal authority who says, do not, just don't. Although his, relationship to her evolves over the course of the film, and we'll come back to that in a moment. She then moves to Mark Ruffalo's character, who's a sort of bon vivant and is sort of an instructor in, the sort of hedonistic life, which has its purpose for her for a short period of time, although it curdles and she moves on. To my mind, the next set of mentors she had were Martha and Harry, the sort of intellectuals, one of whom's a cynic, and then, the madam in the brothel. And then finally, not exactly a mentor, but a sort of guiding figure is, the ultra repressive, sort of ultra controlling husband who she's, left behind. And I thought of Rami Malek sort of almost as kind of Rami Youssef as kind of a fellow traveler with her, because he also seems like a young person who is seeking instruction on how to be a person throughout the film. So I thought of them kind of in different lights. How did you think about them, Andrew?
Well, I found the Willem Dafoe character probably the most interesting of the men because of the way he seems to me to change over the course of the film, and how much of his backstory we get. Everything that he is doing, every experiment he conducts, he says, this is like when my father did X, Y, or Z. And Richard in the chat asked why we get so much of that backstory of his father. And I think part of it is to show where Godwin's impulse and bravura and sort of willingness to move past the guardrails of propriety and scientific experimentation comes from, or come from. But also, I think, to draw a contrast, to show the growth in the character, to show that he, despite being raised by the man who did all those experiments on him and not apparently not having any hostility or not toward him or not recognizing any of that behavior as whatever a word worse than inappropriate is, yet still he grows beyond it. And though he conducts his experiments, and there's certainly a lot to criticize about what he did in creating the Emma Stone character, he clearly isn't his father and factors in things that his father did not. And I think that Youssef is the sort of next iteration of that. He has the sense of inquiry. He has the desire to experiment or explore, but he is far more concerned with ethics and with the sensibilities of the subjects of the experiments and things like that, except I would say at the end when they put the horrible husband's head on a goat's body, which I found problematic, unless the film is trying to tell us something different than I think it was. But so I see those men as being on a continuum. Of course, Jacob's right that this, this is about a girl becoming a young woman, becoming a mature woman, and doing that sort of in an unconventional way. And I think part of the feminist critique within this film is the extent to which so much of that growth and development and charting of a course by that woman gets impacted in rarely or not often constructive ways by men. And you have to have those men have to occupy some of the different spheres that in which men exert control or undue influence on, in this case, the young woman. And so that's why you have those different iterations of malehood, and instead of all existing in one man, which of course those attributes do exist inside, I won't say every man, but many men, you have them separated out into different characters to sort of give them the fuller, almost arguably, you would say, hyperbolic treatment that allows the film to make its point and also be funny. And so those are some of the roles I see those men playing.
Can I just ask one more question on that?
Sure.
Because maybe this is really a mashup, an homage to a bunch of Universal films, because while I was also kind of expecting and a little taken aback by them taking his head and putting it on a goat or whatever they put it on, it struck me immediately as either from Freaks or from The Island of Dr. Moreau. So in some ways, I think that there was a lot of, nods to those old classic male-driven. Even The Bride of Frankenstein had no personality and no autonomy. They were all male-driven movies. So I kind of thought this was just, a soup.
Possibly so. I wanted to touch on the Frankenstein parallel too, which you also mentioned, and Perry just brought it up in the chat too. Because Godwin is this interesting character. He's not a straightforward pastiche of Dr. Frankenstein as we know him. He's more like a compounding of both Dr. Frankenstein, the creator, and Frankenstein's monster, the creation. He himself is the subject of experiences. The way that he's made up obviously calls to mind like Boris Karloff and the Universal Frankenstein films. And in this, there's a sense where he kind of mirrors Bella in a certain way, because he's the creator and the created kind of at once. And she too, being kind of both the mother and the daughter, is sort of has this kind of double existence as, a creator and the created. The thing that struck me in comparison to Frankenstein, and particularly, Mary Shelley's novel, is, the Dr. Frankenstein in the novel and in most of the mythos comes to be repulsed by his monster, and they end up in this, sort of destructive, awful relationship with each other, where they're both kind of at odds. They're connected to each other, but they're also trying to destroy each other. And that's not how it plays out in this film. There is some sense of being at odds at a certain point in the film there, where she's sort of bristling to come out of his sort of parental control. But ultimately he I think proves himself to be, all in all, if unconventional, a reasonably, good father figure. He comes to love her, and really see her not as an experiment, not solely as a man of science, regarding an experiment, but kind of as a relation. And I think that's a interesting riff. He's changed by Bella too. The film isn't just about how Bella is changed by the world. It's about how the world is changed by Bella. I was moved by that.
Gordon, you have a question or comment? Okay. Emily, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I'm interested in how you're defining some of the roles of the men in it, and I loved Mark Ruffalo's character. I just loved seeing him in such a different character than I've ever seen him in before. But I watched her, how Bella didn't seem to be. Yes, she was maturing, and I get that, but I didn't see her this so much about a maturation kind of theme, as it was just experiencing the world. And I mean, she was of the world, she was in the world, but she was not really of the world. She just seemed to take everything in, the good, the bad, the ugly. She didn't weigh it. She just took it in, and then when Ruffalo came along and his character tried to control her and use her, she didn't even, to my mind, she didn't even resist so much as she just ignored it. It was, she enjoyed what she could enjoy with him, but she was her own person. I think that's what I loved about this all the way through. And she just seemed to come to experience the totality of life, even the horrible things that happen. I think that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think the maturation is happening along the way, because we see her react differently to adversity. We see her do more thinking and a better balance of thinking and acting as she gets quote unquote older. But certainly, I mean, like with all of us, a part of our maturation is the gaining of experience by the encounters we have. For many of us, the difference is that when we're the age Bella is the beginning of the film, those encounters are heavily mediated by our parent figures. And in this case, they weren't. And that's part of the humor and part of the experiment and part of the sort of turning it up to 10 that, stories can do to make their points. Jacob.
Yeah, I love that comment, Emily, and it's good to see you here too. I felt that about, Bella too. Her mission is to, I've talked about this in the context of a Bildungsroman, where, a character moves through the world and obtains experience and, goes through a kind of coming of age. But there's also this theme in the movie about like empirical research, about observing the world and, and treating one's life as a sort of interesting experiment. And I really think that comes through too in her sort of interest in sometimes naive interest in experiencing every facet of life. I think this really comes through, or it comes into sharp relief in this section where she's in the where she's working in the brothel. And we've talked about this sort of way that sexuality works in the movie and the role it plays. It certainly is a big part of the film, but I kind of would draw a little bit of a distinction between the way that it's playing out in that segment of the movie and the way that it's played out with Mark Ruffalo and prior to that. Because she when she's in the brothel, her kind of mentor figure, not entirely a positive one, is the Madame Swiney, and who's a really interesting character. And she says to her, the way that you're going through your dark phase, this is where you experience life, all of it. If you want to know the world, you also have to experience degradation. You also have to experience objection. You also have to experience suffering. And, the question of what the purpose of, or what the function of degradation or suffering, or dark experiences have to our development and to our self-understanding and our understanding of the world is a long literary and philosophical tradition, and it's a little bit double-edged coming from Madame Swiney, because it's, depending on how you look at it, that could be a sincere, philosophical position that the character is expressing, or a manipulative one. And this is part of her experience too, which is, being in a situation that, certainly has an exploitative dimension to it. So, I mean, yeah, I love what she said about her being in the world, but not of the world. And it sort of allows her this kind of objectivity, or this sort of ability to kind of look at things without, outside of the framework that, that we're used to looking at things in.
Before we get to our next question, I wanted to mention something that was brought up in the chat. Joan mentions that Mary Shelley's father was named William Godwin. And I think, yes, that can't be a coincidence. I think take from that. Yeah, Jacob, go ahead.
Yeah, well, very interesting. Mary Shelley's parents were both quite remarkable. Mary Wollstonecraft, famously, a sort of early feminist or proto-feminist. And William Godwin was like a kind of an early political radical. He was into a lot of the utilitarian and utopian politics of the day. And there's this sort of great, he was very much interested, or like a representative of this sort of Enlightenment idea that, humans can improve themselves. We can better ourselves. We can develop into, a sort of ideal state. And this theme of, self-improvement or self-making, that's probably a better way to put it, is something that's a very big feature of the film. I mean, this is a film about Bella being made by the world, but it's also a film about Bella making herself and improving herself. She is, and again, she is both the mother and the child. She is her own creation in a certain way. And the film is about her creating herself. And she talks about, can we be improved? So, I mean, I think, and she mirrors Godwin, or Godwin, her father, and Godwin, William Godwin, in that too. So I think that's very intentional indeed, and it's well observed, Joan.
Carolyn, you have a question or comment?
Hi. Oh my gosh, I've been taking so many notes. So I'm just going to fly back real quick to the costumes, just to say that I did watch some kind of an interview of the costumer, or maybe it was the director, and he was saying they did set the worlds and the costumes in that Victorian period because of the Frankenstein, it being in that era, and also because it was, those social mores were so strict. But you'll notice there are things that transcend that, especially in Bella's dress. Like she has like the mini skirt on, she shows her legs, her hair is different. And I believe they said that was to not just confine it like, oh, gee, those darn Victorians, they were so repressed. But no, there are these themes that are through all times, even up to and including ours. And then I wanted to make a comment on the sexuality thing. I personally come from a pretty religious background, and it did make me uncomfortable too. One, I was a little bit worried, like, oh my gosh, what might happen to her? I mean, how really degraded or violent could it get? And I was glad that it didn't go too far. But I think the main thing I came away with was, what does that reaction of mine, so different from Bella's, say about my own conditioning, by my own upbringing, by my own thoughts about really feeling sorry for women who are, to me, wow, that's their last resort, that they would become a prostitute. But how much of that is really my own conditioning about sexuality? And I thought the one thing that Madame Swiney, is that her name, said that I thought was so interesting when she was advising Bella on how to kind of get control of her life or learn about her life. And she said it was kind of something like, you need money. Well, this is the quickest way. I guess with no training or other means, this is the quickest way. And it made me think about those all that stuff surrounding all that. And then I've had a lot of comments about Godwin, but not to carry the metaphor too far, but it reminded me a little of in the Truman Show, where there's a director in the sky who's kind of that God figure, and they have this feeling to protect their creation, their charge, but they come up against this thing about, I guess it's that free will. There's always that in religion, how much of this is we're created, but we're creatures, but how much do we have our own free will? And, I know in the Christian tradition, which I guess is Judaic and Islamic too, is that God created man in his own image. But by that same token, I think we create God in our own image, right? And I think, I'm just thinking about this with all the things you guys were saying, and like the Godwin was not perfect. He had his own scars. And I thought it was so interesting that we're watching and thinking this man was tortured by his father. And yet he put a positive spin on everything. Which I don't even know. And like I said, I don't want to torture that metaphor about being God, but I think just our relationship with God, that's one of those personal things that, how much it's the rules, but it's also, well, there's the love and there's the rules and there's that balance between there. And then the last thing I would just love to maybe push us on to, we talked about some of the male characters and we touched on the female characters, but I loved the female supporting characters in this. I love the blonde woman. I can't think of her name, but oh my God, I wanted more of her. I wish she had hung around for longer, because I loved her presence. And Madame Swiney was just so what's the word? Smart, but streetwise. And even the young Black prostitute that she became friends with, it was almost like they kind of became almost sisters, and there was things they could each sort of share with each other. And I love that support of the women for the other women in the movie as well. So now I'm going to shut up.
Well, thanks, Carolyn. You raised a tremendous number of interesting points and things to think about. In particular, the religion aspect is one, I think, that if I were to see this film again, and I don't know that I will, but if I were to see this film again, I would think about that much more than I did in my first viewing or my most recent viewing. So I appreciate that. I don't have anything to add. I just think there were a lot of interesting, insightful comments there.
I agree. What a rich comment. You touched on so many interesting things. I'll try to handle a couple of the things you brought up. First of all, thank you for bringing up the costuming. How extraordinary. This, whether or not you like the movie, I think it's hard to deny what a spectacular work of craft this is. And I think the costuming is so interesting and so distinct. It is cool the way it sort of mashes up this kind of Victorian costuming with like, it spins it in interesting ways. Like you mentioned, like she wears this sort of mini skirt or these short shorts, and she wears these boots that I heard. I listened to a interview with a costumer too, who said that sort of 1960s, like Pierre Cardin's space age design was like a big influence too. The thing that I thought was interesting was they said that one of the pieces of Victorian costuming, which is very common in period films, is a corset, but they didn't use any of those. They never had any characters wearing a corset in the film because they
Well,
felt
Mrs. Swiney does. Miss Swiney
Mrs.
does.
Swiney does. That's interesting. Bella never does, I guess.
Right.
And Bella is the character who cannot be, for better or worse,
Constrained.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's kind of it's interesting to think about that. I'm glad you mentioned that, Andrew. I have to think about what it means that Mrs. Swiney wears one. With regards to, touching on the sexuality element of it again, I mean, I think the film does challenge, it is challenging in that respect, certainly. And it does challenge us to sort of, I think many viewers may be made uncomfortable by it. And in some ways, I think that's intentional. It challenges us to think about why we are uncomfortable with it, or the terms of our discomfort with it, if that's how we feel. I don't know, we could say a lot more about this, but I'll simply say one of the characteristics of Bella is that she is somebody who is totally without shame. Like, she doesn't understand why sexuality is supposed to be something that's for the private sphere, and the body is supposed to be something for the private sphere, not the public sphere. And the film kind of treats that in the same way. It doesn't, a lot of films will sort of tastefully cut away or, suggest what's going on during a love scene. And this one doesn't turn away. I also don't think that the sex scenes are meant to be particularly titillating. If anything, they're played for comedy most of the time. So, I mean, I think one of the ways that Bella approaches the world is just kind of like looking at it without any preconceptions, and the film sort of takes that approach in certain ways too, and challenges us, or sometimes it runs us into our own sort of preconceptions, and we can grapple with that. Good looking out on the great female characters too. I'll mention just briefly so we can move on, but the character who plays Martha, the actress who plays Martha, who's the older woman she meets on the boat, is Hannah Shagula, who is a legendary European actress. She was in a lot of films made by Rainer Werner Fassbinder, the great German filmmaker. So she's somebody who brings a lot of cinematic legacy with her.
Jacob, before we get to our next questioner, Dana, I did want to mention two somewhat related comments that were brought up in the chat. One was a comment about the dance sequence, or scene, and the fact that in so many movies about the coming of age, more conventional coming of age stories, there is a dance, whether it was the Fabelmans or whether it's, The Help and another Emma Stone character, who was unconventional, but not nearly as unconventional coming of age.
Yeah.
And then related to that, someone else also asks, Nancy asks about the music and how, it was jarring and relatively unconventional, which, again, I think in the spirit of jarring experiments and unconventional quests for knowledge, having the music be that way is totally appropriate. A film that is combining, Victorian era with flying ships and all sorts of things of, aesthetics and other things that didn't exist in the Victorian era, having unconventional music makes total sense. I think that the inclusion of a dance scene is very interesting and probably a more thoughtful choice than it might initially seem. Did you think about that, Jacob?
Oh yeah, I love that comment and I love that observation. Right. It's interesting because it's a sort of well, first of all, I mean, I think it's just a great rollicking set piece. I really loved it. But it's also supposed to be a couples dance, and she keeps sort of breaking free of it. And Ruffalo seems to sort of be trying to wrestle her back into a sort of couples dance, but she kind of wants to go wild on her own. But I thought it was just I mean, we've talked a lot about the great sort of physical language of the film. Great stuff from Emma Stone and also from Ruffalo. What did you think, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way the dance is sort of a microcosm or a foreshadowing of what the next sort of act of the movie is going to be, which is sort of her trying to get away from him and him sort of weaving in and out, sort of getting close to her, thinking he's figured out a way to sort of catch her or trap her. And then of course she outsmarts him and then gets away. And again, I think the idea that this is in so many of those movies. I mean, I even think about something like the Magnificent Ambersons, the way, how important the sort of, the debut of the character is, and the sort of talk about rules and formality and tradition. I think it was really smart, not a major moment, but a smart thing to choose to include given all the options. Let's see, Dana. I should have known we would hear from you. Where there is talk about great performances, you will have something to say.
And I do, and it's not about the performances. How do you like that? Well,
I do.
I just absolutely saw this movie minutes ago. So the 4:00 show. So it is the freshest in my mind, maybe of anybody. And I have to say that I'm just kind of coming down from it. And this discussion is surprising a little bit to me, because I found this movie to be enormous. The scope of it was huge. It was so weird, incredibly weird, weirder than movies I generally like, and beautiful. And the beauty and the weirdness was larger than the acting. As much as I loved Emma Stone and I loved all the characters, all of them, Mark Ruffalo particularly, I just saw this as this, oh my goodness. It's a Bildungsroman for sure, but it's also David Copperfield, which I recently read. So and the best way I can explain it is I felt like I was going through this world with Bella as she was seeing it, kind of black and white in the beginning. I had a hard time getting into it. I thought I was lost in the beginning of this movie. The fisheye camera shots really made me a little nauseous and weirded out. And then when the color came and the camera work was the same, fisheye, I guess. I don't, I'm sure there's a better technical way of describing it. It was enormous. The impact on me was enormous. The beauty of it, the color, definitely the costumes, but also the magnificence of that ship, and the way it looked sailing on the water. I just felt like I was going through David Copperfield, meeting these strange, peculiar characters, not knowing what to make of them, just as David Copperfield didn't know what to make of them. And Bella didn't know what to make of them either. And she just worked from her gut. I mean, her father, God, and she called him God, so I thought it was God, was so disfigured that he couldn't go out in public. Then I mean, I don't have to go through the litany of characters or anything. I think you're getting my point. I felt like I was traveling through a beautiful time warp, with difficulty, and I struggled until I realized that her journey was going to come to some fruition, which didn't really happen for me until, the best way I can describe it is, until I think she learned to walk. I thought it took a very long time for Bella to learn to not walk like a zombie. And until the end, when she sort of stood up straight and really walked, and I realized this is taking me somewhere. And then I knew what it was doing. The only other thing I want to say is the ending. I found the ending perplexing because there was a tone, a feeling that I got at the end of this movie of not quite disliking her, but feeling that she's totally lost her innocence. She happily put the goat's brain in her horrible ex-husband or husband's head. And she also was unkind to the new girl, the new experiment, when she said to her, go get water. I thought there were things about her that weren't very nice, and it left me unsettled. But that's okay, because I found this movie to be extremely unsettling and huge. And that's all I have.
Well, thanks very much, Dana. Yeah, I agree with you on the third act. I didn't understand why she would go with her original husband. It seemed like she knew enough about men and had learned enough about the world that that wouldn't be as appealing to her as it would have been when she was younger. And I also found her to have hostility or a cruelty or a negligence for those two characters you mentioned as well at the end, her sort of sister, if you will, and what she did to uh, her husband, as awful as he was. And the thing I don't know is that a blind spot in the film, and that we're supposed to see her as a fully realized, and I don't know if admirable, but sort of reasonably decent human? Or is the point that she's gone through her maturation, she's been exposed to all these things in the world, and it has in some ways made her as rotten as the people that she was first repelled by and controlled by when she was younger? And I'm not sure it's the second. And that's to me, that's a mark off um to me in the film. But that's my perspective. Jacob.
Well, first off, thanks so much for that, your comments, Dana, and for your perspective, Andrew. I kind of wanted to speak to the weirdness of the film, which you touched on a little bit, and to try to characterize that a little bit. For me, this film had a really interesting and sort of one-of-a-kind tone that sort of oscillated between like kind of sweet and cozy and totally morbid and grotesque. Oftentimes when when oftentimes I found myself touched by something unexpectedly in the film, and just when I was sort of getting comfortable, something grotesque would happen. Um, it's a really unique sensibility, and I think that comes through in the music too, which came up earlier in our conversation, but wasn't really we didn't talk about that much. I thought the music in the film was quite extraordinary. It's done by a first-time film composer who uses records under the name Jerskin Fendrix, an English guy, young guy, with a background in sort of experimental pop music. This was his first film score, and I thought it was quite extraordinary. It sort of goes between lush and evocative and discordant, and discomforting. Yeah, I thought it was really special. I also wanted to talk about the sort of unconventional lenses that are used in the film, which is part of its visual mark. I found it very striking and arresting when I saw the film for the first time, but I wasn't totally sure what to make of the fisheye lens and the sort of pinhole, shots that kind of invert it. But I think I've started to come to a theory of it. I've seen the film twice, and in my second viewing, I started to, think about, well, there are times where the image is bent so it looks like we're kind of looking outside of like from within a fishbowl, looking out into the world outside, and then other times where the sort of lens narrows and we have a very dark screen and just kind of one area in the center, which makes it look like we're kind of looking into a fishbowl. And I connected that a little bit with like Bella being both kind of the mother and the child. I mean, I think of like a fishbowl, like kind of like being the womb. So she's sort of inside the womb and outside the womb at the same time. And I was also thinking about, Bella as this film as a kind of um, meditation on like taking on this kind of scientific aspect, looking at the subject through a kind of empirical observational lens. And there are times where Bella is the sort of experiment of the film, where we're watching the way that, this creature develops in the world. But through this journey, we're also looking at the world, through fresh eyes and observing the world, through her eyes. So we're both kind of looking from without and looking from within at the same time. And I thought that using these sort of these unconventional lenses and bending our perspective, you know, through those, formal choices was an interesting way to kind of emphasize that theme.
And I thought it was an unnecessary director's flourish that served more to distance me from the film than give me any special perspective on it. Meredith, you have a question or comment? All right. Meredith, you there? Go ahead.
I had posted the query about the dance stuff.
Oh, okay.
I'm good.
All right. Thanks, Meredith. Let's see. JD, you have a question or comment?
Yes, hi. Enjoying the conversation. I enjoyed the movie a whole lot from many perspectives, visual and psychological and all that. And I guess a couple comments and a question. I just thought she went through the movie. The words that come to mind is, she was a winner and she was empowered through the whole time. She went through some situations that could really knock somebody down or back. And throughout the movie, she always moved forward. She won. She was empowered. And I enjoyed that part. So just a comment that I fully enjoyed the movie and I should probably see it again because of that. My question is, I didn't quite understand the reason for the other female that was beginning her growth and maturation when she returned back to the home. And if there's any meaning of that person in a deep way or just, the next experiment. That's it.
Thanks, JD. I think it was sort of just the next experiment. Jacob, what do you think?
Well, I was thinking about it a little bit as a sort of contrast to the relationship between Godwin and Bella. What he says in the film after she leaves is basically he says, I've gotten too attached. I've lost my objectivity. We need to try this again, but but treat it just like scientists, and be more detached and less parental. And the purely scientific experiment doesn't really yield a person. I don't know. One of the things that I thought was a very compelling, dimension of the film was watching the relationship between those two characters, between Bella and Godwin develop. And it seems like once he, the more he begins to see her in terms of being a sort of person with agency and with her own, I don't know, with her own, interesting and valuable personhood, the richer their relationship gets and the sort of more they're able to make peace with each other and love each other despite, some of the traumatizing things about their relationship. And Felicity is the sort of contrast to that. She they set out to to not be parental, and it doesn't result in a person. I would have liked to see him come around to her a little bit more before he before his end. But that was my thinking about it.
And I think there were a lot of things in the third act that weren't necessary. And I think the second young woman is one of them. I can imagine a longer story where we see more of the relationship between her and Bella, and that might have been interesting and sort of instructive to the themes. But in the way the film sort of ends up, I didn't think it really added anything. Marianne, you have another question or comment?
Yes, thank you. I know we talked a lot about the connection with the Frankenstein story. I was kind of seeing some elements of the Taming of the Shrew, specifically with the interaction with Mark Ruffalo. There was like this thing that he was going to kind of break her. So I wanted to share that. the other thing was that there was an element of her behavior, especially early on, that was cruel. And the woman that kind of was the closest thing to a mother for her was the woman that worked, for God. And she even said that she did not like Bella. And then when the next experiment came along, you could see more of a kind of mother-daughter connection that the housekeeper had with the new experiment. And then when we get to see who Bella was, when Bella goes back to the husband and she's asking the question, well, who was I? And it's revealed to her that she was cruel. And I realized then, okay, the parent of the baby that becomes Bella's brain is this incredibly cruel man. And Bella's former self, who is revealed then to have also been cruel. So I realized that Bella has kind of inherited a level of cruelty, and then seeing how that kind of shows up. In other words, like there was something off with her moral compass. It wasn't just about her sexual expression. And I do think that something needed to happen to the husband so that like I could have some level of closure that he wasn't going to be able to be cruel to anyone else. So I kind of liked the fact that he got turned into a goat and wasn't going to be able to hurt anyone. That's it.
I appreciate that, because while I still think the third act was excessive, the point you make about, how a question sort of about nature versus nurture is raised, although we could even argue, I guess, that some of the cruelty might have come from some of the nurture, as much as Willem Dafoe tried not to be. There obviously was some inherent cruelty in that arrangement. And so it has more purpose for me now because of your comments than it did a few minutes ago. So I appreciate that. Jacob?
Yeah, I really appreciated your comments too, Marianne. I love the Taming of the Shrew comparison, and I thought of Pygmalion too. Those are one of the themes in this film is like improvement. How do you improve a person? And those are both texts about projects of improvement, projects of improving a person. And this film ultimately, I think plays with those, and then sort of, the character sort of breaks out of those and into a sort of different, process of self-improvement. I appreciated your comments too on the ending. Very well put.
Carolyn, you have another question or comment?
Oh my gosh, this discussion is so great. Yeah, I love the comments about the cruelty. And that's another one of those things where when I saw it, I like, especially when she was real little and she like sort of made the guy squish the frog. And I was thinking like, well, there are kids that do that. And again, it made me think like, so how much of cruelty like that do we learn? Like, how much do we have to learn that, oh, there's pain. And if you do that, it's like if you got that pain, and we have to teach kids empathy and teach them about life. And I just a great comment I thought you made. And in terms of, I've been describing it to people. I said, okay, no spoilers, but I said, it reminds me a little of Frankenstein meets Candide, but through the lens of Fellini. And
the fisheye lens of Fellini.
Yeah, right. Oh, and then I posted a link to an interview with Emma Stone and Mark Ruffalo and the director. And there's a lot of, they crack each other up, and there's a lot of time spent because they're just trying to get their composure. But the director talks a lot about why he used that fisheye lens thing. So for anybody that's interested in that. And then I think just coming back on some of this, when someone, I can't remember if it was Andrea or Jacob, was mentioning, she kept saying, I think people can improve. And she wanted to improve herself. And I know that, really good literature, any good art is not usually it's not preaching. It's not trying to send you a message. but I did find this, if I was like hoping that maybe we could all take a message of like, we can all improve, and we can even put that to our society, right? We see things in our society that we don't like, and we know that we're not perfect, and there's a lot of stuff we need to fix. But I found it very hopeful movie that if we just could try to take a step back sometimes and look at why we're reacting to things a certain way, or why someone else is reacting to something a certain way, and how can we, give each other a little more grace and find ways that we can improve our society. That I don't know, I just thought it was very positive. And I actually didn't see her as, I didn't interpret it as being cruel to the girl. I kind of felt like that was now how she was going to pass it on a little bit, like the new girl, the new experiment now would get the benefit of all the learning, and that Bella went through that and could help her get her knowledge in a way that doesn't hold her back, and that facilitates her getting that knowledge. And again, I made this larger connection to like our society. How can we pass on what we have to younger generations, and instead of holding people back, help people be the best they can be everything they can be. And, the world would just be great. Okay. Yay.
Thanks, Carolyn. I do think it's possible that's how she's going to view the second young woman, but I think if the film wanted us to come away with that idea that she was going to treat her better than she was treated, and more constructively, and give her the benefit of her experiences so she too didn't have to go on that journey, I think the film could have communicated that more clearly. I think if you're already inclined to think the best of her character, that's how you'll take it. But if you're not, I think it's open to interpretation. I also think the cruelty thing is a bit tricky, and part of the reason it's tricky is we don't exactly know what mental age she is at certain points in the film. I mean, cruelty is only cruelty if you understand what you're doing. So when a 10-year-old throws a rock at an animal, that's cruel. If a 2-year-old throws an acorn at an animal, that's probably not cruel. And so I think that certainly by the time she's at the end of the film, we know she knows the difference. It's not clear from some of those things early on, like when she has the frog be smushed, is she mentally 12 or is she mentally 3? And that makes a difference. But I do think it is trying to raise a nature nurture question about cruelty, and probably some other things too.
I mean, one of the interesting, I think, things that the film explores is like finding a balance between like liberating oneself from society's strictures, but then also constraining oneself into society's like standards, because there's a sense that, Bella sort of moves two ways. One of the dynamics that she has through the film is that she wants to express herself, or feels compelled to express herself in ways that this Victorian society and these, sometimes controlling figures in her life don't want her to do. And we look at her sort of breaking out of those. And generally, I think we think, that's a good thing. And generally, I think we, in many ways, we look in general at self-expression as a positive thing. I mean, I think we're glad that we don't live in the Victorian age, right? But there's this other sort of counter dynamic in the film, which is that we do see Bella have these like do things that are cruel, or have these like instincts in the film that over the course of which she needs to like learn to curtail. And this is an important part of like being a person in the world and being a member of society too, which is like you can't punch the baby. Like we, part of like being a grown-up person means learning to, when it's not appropriate, to just express everything that,
Control your impulses.
Exactly. And so, I mean, this is something that the film plays with a little bit. I think that's like and the function of cruelty and, throughout the narrative, I think is sort of in tension with, with the sort of positive self-expression in the film. To what extent, Is it positive to be liberated? And to what extent is it
A
necessary?
burden.
Right.
Oh,
Or harmful? Or to what extent is
right.
it necessary for the individual or for society or whatever, or social structures to curtail or restrain, everybody from expressing, whatever impulses occur to them as, a young person does in the world. So, I mean, that's not in that's sometimes that's a real philosophical question. I mean, and it's an interesting question to contemplate, where those boundaries are and how those forces exist in tension with each other. I was glad that the film picked that up, and I thought it was richer for it than had it just been a story about, Bella smashing through kind of one restraint after the next. There are places where, she's inappropriate and she legitimately, like, for the improvement of her person, she needs to curtail or she needs to control.
It looks like we have a last comment from Meredith.
Yeah, thanks. Now I do want to say something. I think part of what's coming up in this conversation that's so interesting to me is that there's a difference between cruelty for fun, cruelty out of curiosity, and cruelty with a purpose. So like the cruelty, she's horrified when, she asks her husband, was I cruel? Oh yeah, like together we just like mocked the servants and ridiculed them. I mean, and the cruelty for fun is like that's a flaw of her former character. And I think I see crushing the frog as like a cruelty of curiosity that a child might have. Like, does the frog feel pain like we do, And interestingly enough, I thought the goat's brain thing was just turning her husband into a satyr, into someone who's not really human because he wasn't humane, And I think it was interesting to me a way a lot of this, I think, picks up on like points in civilization and its discontents, that if people could do whatever they wanted, they would be cruel. They would enact all their sexual impulses and whatever. And if they're going to be human, they can't do all those things. They have to learn how to manage those things. So that was kind of what I wanted to say.
Well, thanks, Meredith. That's a thoughtful comment for us to end on. And I think we've made a lot of good progress with this film, but obviously there's plenty more to talk about. And we encourage people to do that, and we encourage you to come see it again at Bryn Mawr Film Institute if you want to. If you liked what you heard and participated in tonight, we have a number of education offerings coming up. You can see them on your screen. We will be doing another one of these discussions next month, and if you get our weekly education email on Thursdays, you will be the first to hear about it this Thursday. Otherwise, you'll hear about it after that, and it'll be up on our website, but it'll be one that will, I think, be at least as interesting to you as this one, probably.
An interesting parallel title too, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Some similar topics are brought up in that film as well. We've got some multi-week courses and we've got some seminars coming up. These are the features we now have playing, including Poor Things. If anything anyone said tonight makes you want to go back and revisit the film, you can still do that at BMFI. And we've got a number of other films currently playing, and American Fiction, a very interesting film coming up starting this week as well. So we hope to see you at the theater. There's a lot to see, both with our new films and our special programs. In addition, we are just wrapping up our annual appeal, and if you like what we do and you have the means and interest to support us, we would greatly appreciate it. We can't do what we do without all of you, literally tonight in the case of the discussion, but also all year round. We need the support of our patrons and members, and certainly when you become a member or buy a ticket, you're supporting us. But if you can do a little more, particularly at this time of year, we would really appreciate it. And you'll be one of our community stars, and we rely on all of you. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody. Jacob, thank you for your wonderful introduction and great comments tonight.
Andrew.
And thank you all for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next time or at the movies.